I'm Jordan Petsos, Chair of the Department of Economics and Finance, and it's a great pleasure and privilege for the University of Scranton to be able to welcome Dr. Acemoglu, the Elizabeth and James Killian Professor of Economics from MIT. Before we introduce our speaker tonight, I would like to acknowledge the Robert Zuckerberg Foundation for their continuous financial support. Without this support, we would not be able to have this event. Also, I'd like to recognize the dedicated team of faculty and staff in my department, as well as our OD officers and the moderator, whose commitment continues to ensure a successful Henry George event. Thank you all for your hard work and commitment. Our Henry George lecture series continues the tradition of attracting excellent speakers. Several of our past speakers have received the Nobel Prize in Economics shortly after they deliver an annual Henry George lecture here at the University of Scranton. This year's Nobel Prize in Economics was awarded to Thomas Sargent and Christopher Sims. Thomas Sargent was our Henry George speaker back in 2006. Actually, every MIT professor who was invited and delivered a Henry George lecture here at the university, Robert Solow, Paul Krugman, and Peter Diamond, had to also make a trip to Sweden afterwards for receiving the Nobel Prize in Economics. This is impressive, 100% successful. We are successful in predicting Nobel Prize winners for MIT professors. Professor Acemoglu, thank you for joining us this evening, and we hope you continue our tradition, or you help us continue this tradition. I would like now to invite my colleague, Dr. Christos Pargianats, to formally introduce our speaker tonight. Thanks, Christos.
Thank you, Dr. Jordan Petsos. Professor Daron Acemoglu is the Elizabeth and James Killian Professor of Economics at MIT. He received his PhD and master's degree from the London School of Economics and his bachelor's degree from the University of York. He was lecturer at the London School of Economics in 1992, and since 1993, he has held faculty positions at MIT. Professor Acemoglu is the co-editor of Econometrica, the Review of Economics and Statistics, and the National Bureau of Economic Research Macroeconomic Annual. He is also a member of the editorial board of several prestigious economic journals. He has received numerous awards and prizes, among them the John Bates Clark Medal, awarded by the American Economic Association to that American economist under the age of 40 who have made a significant contribution to economic thought and knowledge. Professor Acemoglu is interested in political economy, economic development, economic growth, economic theory, labor economics, technology, income and wage inequality, human capital and training, and network economics. He has published many papers in leading economic journals like Econometrica, the American Economic Review, the Quarterly Journal of Economics, and others. He has written the book Introduction of Modern Economic Growth, and he is the co-author of the forthcoming book Why Nations Fail: Origins of Power, Prosperity, and Poverty. His research is of great significance because it attempts to answer one of the most important questions in economics: why some countries are rich while others are poor. The answer that most conventional economic growth theories provide to this question is that rich countries are the countries that adopt growth-enhancing economic policies. But this answer, in fact, does not explain why some countries adopt growth-enhancing economic policies while others do not. Political economy of growth is a relatively new area in economics that combines political economy theory and economic growth theory in order to explain, among others, why countries with good political institutions adopt good economic policies and therefore are rich, while countries with poor political institutions do not adopt good for economic growth policies and therefore are poor. Professor Acemoglu is the most influential researcher in this area of economics and has benefited many economists, including myself. It's a great pleasure to have him with us tonight. We will have the opportunity at the end of this lecture for a Q&A session. Please help me welcome Professor Daron Acemoglu.
Thank you very much, Christos, and thank you very much, Jordan, for the nice introduction. And it's a great honor to be here to deliver the Henry George lecture. Actually, what I'm going to talk about is, as Christos mentioned, is based on my forthcoming book jointly written with Jim Robinson, my longtime collaborator who was at the government department at Harvard. It's actually quite intimately related to Henry George's contributions. At some level, it's almost Georgist. You know, what we're going to be talking about is what are the constraints, in particular political constraints, that prevent the forces of markets from being used for economic growth. And at some level, George was one of the early economists and social scientists to start thinking deeply about these sets of issues. So it's particularly telling, in particular, you know, at some level, you know, if two names need to be mentioned in this context, they would be Adam Smith and Henry George. So I'm mentioning Henry George now, and I'll mention Adam Smith in a few seconds. But both, the shadow of both will be cast all over what I'm going to talk about. So as I mentioned, this is going to be based on my work with Jim Robinson, which is the topic of our forthcoming book. The book will come out in March, and I just got the cover, the PDF of the cover from my publisher, so I can't resist showing it. So I'm pretty excited, but it's not out yet. But we have the cover at least, so that's how it will look like. So why nations fail? So why did we write this book, and why am I here to talk about it? I'm going to try to argue that the sets of issues that surround the question of why nations fail and why some nations fail and some nations succeed are among the most challenging but also more central ones for social science. And despite a long tradition of great social scientists, historians, and philosophers having worked on this topic, we're still far from a consensus. And our intention is to bring a somewhat new perspective to these issues and try to push the debate in a direction that we think is fruitful. So just to get us started, here is the picture of how the world looks like. The dark areas here are relatively poor countries. They are the ones with income per capita in purchasing power parity adjusted dollars in 2008 that have less than $2,000. And those that are with lighter colors get gradually richer and richer. So a couple of patterns are visible in this graph. The first is that if you look at the numbers in the legend, there are huge differences in income per capita across countries. Large swaths of the world are in white. They have incomes over 20,000, in many cases close to 40,000, and large parts of the globe is covered in dark color, less than 2,000. So those sorts of income differences across countries are quite striking. 40-fold differences in income per capita across countries in a globalized, connected world. The second point that's quite noteworthy here is that there is actually a distinct geographic pattern to this. It's not like a checker box with the black next to white. While there are areas where light and dark colors are next to each other, there is quite a concentration of dark colors in certain parts. Sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Asia, darker colors in South America than North America, much lighter colors in Western Europe, and much lighter colors in Australia and New Zealand. So whatever theory we have to offer to understand these patterns has to explain both these wide differences and also why they are distributed in this particular pattern that we see on this map. There is a third important feature, and that's about the timing of these differences. As I said, the second person I would like to emphasize here is Adam Smith, and Adam Smith, of course, was not only a brilliant philosopher, but is also the founder of our discipline of economics. And Adam Smith's most important work, The Wealth of Nations, sounds very similar to Why Nations Fail, was actually motivated by the same question. What makes some nations wealthy? What is the origin of their wealth? And he did actually talk about several of the same issues that I'm going to be discussing here. So there were some parallels between him and Henry George too. But the notable thing is that when Adam Smith was writing at the end of the 18th century, the gap that appeared quite large to him between rich and poor countries was actually much smaller than what we see today. We don't have national income accounts, but our best guess estimates would suggest that the richest country was about 4 or perhaps at most 5 times as rich as the poorest part in the world, while, as I mentioned, the differences today are over 40-fold. So since Adam Smith started theorizing about the origins of wealth of some nations and the poverty of others, the problem, the disparity, has become much wider. So here is a picture summarizing this, not showing every country but subcontinents, based on historical research by Angus Madison, sort of projecting back and making guesstimates because, as I said, there are no national income accounts, but still fairly accurate picture in terms of what's been going on. And the remarkable thing is that this graph is on exponential scale. So what that means is that if countries were growing at the same rate, or if the ratios in their incomes were remaining constant, these lines would be parallel. What you see is not only a fanning out, so big inequality opening up, but it's happening at a much, much, much faster rate starting around 1800. So it's really around 1800, after Adam Smith's important book, that this big inequality that we're seeing actually have opened up. So again, a successful theory should not only account for the 2 other patterns that I've suggested, but also for why the timing of this great divergence across countries started in 1800 and took the form of some countries in Western Europe and then the Western offshoots becoming much richer, while many others not growing as much, as you can see from Africa, Latin America, and Asia. And it's this differences in the growth potential, growth trajectory of these different nations or different continents, as you can see in this picture, is the one that accounts for the other patterns that we've seen on the world map. So to develop our theory, I'm going to go back to a historical episode. The quote-unquote beginning in Latin America, not that there wasn't anything before in Latin America, as I will explain there was, but this is the beginning of the societies that we see in today in Latin America, the beginning of the colonization process. So as everybody is aware, Spaniards sailed to the Americas and quickly started conquering and colonizing many parts of the Americas, in particular in the South. The history of Pizarro and Cortez are well known, but perhaps equally telling is that of Juan Diaz de Solis and his men who colonized Rio de la Plata in 1516. River of Silver, because they had encountered silver in this area. In fact, it turns out that the silver wasn't indigenous to that part, but was coming from the Inca Empire, so be it. But they ferociously went about their colonization, and one of de Solis' men, Pedro de Mendoza, founded Buenos Aires. Now, you would think Buenos Aires would be the sort of place that Europeans should like. The climate is exactly like what the Spaniards were used to in Spain. Today, it's known for its great climate, very fertile land, and all the good things that we sort of associate with that sort of climate. But actually, their colonization of Buenos Aires and that entire Rio de la Plata region was an entire failure. What they tried to do was exactly what Cortez and Pizarro and all the other European colonialists tried to do. They tried to enslave the locals, put them to work, make them produce food for themselves, and hopefully find the gold and the silver, and so that they could extract it. But no luck. The people they encountered there, the Cheruas and the Quarendi, were very mobile, very sparsely settled, essentially hunter-gatherer level civilizations. They tried to enslave them, no luck. They ran away. When they captured them, they fought back, and in one of these, they killed the Soles, being clubbed to death by one of the Cheruas. And Spaniards soon decided, this is not going to work. We're not going to be able to enslave these people. But in the meantime, one of de Soles's men, the Ayolas, had moved up the river, the Parana River, and discovered what is today Paraguay. There, they encountered another band of Indians, but a little different. Not so much. It's not, they didn't discover the Inca Empire or the Aztec Empire or the old Maya civilizations. Just slightly different set of Indians. But the big difference was that these Indians were a little more densely settled, and they had already developed a hierarchy. So the Guarani were thus easier target for the Spaniards. They quickly conquered the lands of the Guarani. They deposed their rulers, they replaced the rulers, they put the Guarani to work, and they started one of the long-lasting colonies of the southern cone of Latin America. And in fact, the entire colonization process of the Guarani has so many similars to the colonization of the Aztecs, of the Incas, it's very hard not to conclude that this was a sort of a well-rehearsed sort of strategy. But it didn't work when they tried to do the Buenos Aires, because the conditions on the ground didn't work for them. What about the North America? Well, North America wasn't colonized by the Spaniards, but by the British. A little later, at the very beginning of the 17th century, the British sent their colonization force under the Virginia Company. The Jamestown was where they were going to do the colonization, and this is the story of John Smith and the Pocahontas, so it's sort of well known. But what I would like to remind you is what a colossal failure this was. Leave aside all of these nice stories, Europeans essentially died almost to the last man, because the Indians that they encountered there were just like the Cheruas and the Quarendi. They were very mobile, not cooperative, and very sparsely settled. So the first strategy that the Europeans used in the north was exactly the same as the one that they tried to use in the south of the continent. No matter that one was British, the other one was Spaniard. It was the same strategy. Capture the Indians, get gold from them, put them to work, enslave them, and take over the hierarchy. But in the same way that it didn't work in Buenos Aires, it didn't work in Jamestown. The conditions weren't right for it. But in Jamestown, there was no Parana River that they could sail up to and find another more densely settled population. So the Virginia Company started looking for another solution. What else can they do? The first strategy didn't work. Their second strategy was only slightly different. They said, okay, we can't enslave the Indians, let's bring our slaves back ourselves. They brought in indentured servants who were supposed to work under very harsh conditions for very low pay, and produce money, produce food and agricultural output for the elite of the Virginia Company. But that didn't work either. That didn't work either, despite the draconian measures that the Virginia Company was willing to go to. So here I just quoted from the laws that were passed by the two leading directors or the governors of the Virginia Company in Jamestown, Sir Thomas Gates and Sir Thomas Dale. If you look quickly at the text of this law, a couple of things will strike you. First of all, pretty much anything you could do was punishable by death. So this was not a lovely, cuddly colony, everybody going there for happiness and sort of religious freedom or anything like that. This was a pretty harsh place. But the second thing that should strike you is that these weren't just harshness. There was a logic to this. And the logic was that they were trying to stop these people from going and trading or living with the Indians. Because the same conditions that made the colonization of Jamestown just not very profitable when they tried to capture the Indians also made it very difficult to exploit the indentured servants and the other low-class people that they brought in. because this was an open frontier country, and anybody could run away and start their own settlements far from the authority of the Virginia Company. So their solution to that was, well, we'll punish you by death if you ever attempt. Well, whatever the threats, that didn't work either. So finally, Virginia Company converged on a third strategy, not willingly, but kicking and screaming. It was something entirely different. Said, we can't force gang labor. There are no Indians to exploit. Well, why don't we give incentives to people? So a revolutionary idea. So they came up with the head right system. They gave land to the settlers, and they said, if you produce, you can keep it. We'll just take some tax. But that wasn't enough. The settlers said, no, just the head right system is great, but how do we know we can actually trust you? You were just trying to kill us and force us and whip us and put us in gang labor just a couple of years ago. So if we're going to trust you, we need not only economic incentives, but we need political right. So soon the head right system was followed by a General Assembly. So an entirely different society started developing in Jamestown and later in other parts of North America, where people were given economic incentives. They could invest and produce and keep what they were producing. And this was supported by the political power that they themselves had. The political power no longer rested with Sir Thomas Gate and Sir Thomas Dale. It rested with the people. Now, if we want to make sense of the divergence that I showed you, I think it's essential that we understand why the colonies in the north and the colonies in the south ended up on very different trajectories. And the story that I told you, albeit it's just a story, it's just one episode, but it actually has a lot of generality to it. The patterns that occurred in other colonies had a lot of similarity to it. And in all of these cases, the differences that were already apparent in the 17th century as the head right system and the General Assemblies developed in the north and a harsh colonization, harsh colonial empire based on forced labor, a very hierarchical form of repression, and few making a lot of money at the expense of the rest, developed in the south, we could see that this had nothing to do with the identity of who the colonizers were. Yes, sure, in the north we had the Protestant British, in the south the Catholic Spaniards, but this wasn't about being Catholic or Protestant. They had exactly the same incentives. Their model was exactly the same. The only difference was that in the south they had the Guarani and the Aztecs and the Incas to colonize. In the north they couldn't find them, so they had to come up with something else. It had nothing to do with climate, topography, disease environment, and so on. Of course, there were differences in this in different parts of the continent. Africa is, of course, very different than Asia. Asia is very different than the Americas. But what made Buenos Aires not attractive and Paraguay attractive for the Spaniards wasn't that Buenos Aires was less healthy. In fact, Buenos Aires' good air was in all likelihood much, much better for the Europeans. There were no mosquitoes there. The climate was exactly that they were used to. But they weren't after climate. They weren't there for holidays. They were there to actually find people and put to work, and they couldn't do that in Buenos Aires. So some of the theories that have received most attention throughout social science and philosophy, emphasizing national cultural attitudes, emphasizing religious attitudes, emphasizing who was the colonizer, don't get us very far. Another very popular set of theories emphasizing geographic differences, productivity differences in agriculture, differences in disease environments, they don't get us very far. Another set of theories, which are the ones that are perhaps the most popular among economists, which is about whether the leaders are adopting the right policies because they can work out exactly what problems to solve. So there's the perspective that, it's the good leaders who find the right policies that make their countries rich. That's not going to get us very far either. The difference between the Virginia Company and the colonizers of Latin America wasn't that some of them had the right model of which policies were going to enrich a place and which policies were, and the other ones didn't understand which policies were going to enrich their country. They weren't interested in enriching the areas they were colonizing. They were interested in extracting as much resources as they could, and in one place that was feasible, in the other place it wasn't. And because it wasn't feasible, that led to a very different path of institutional development. So really, if we want to understand this particular source of divergence, and I will argue if we want to understand all of that divergence that I showed you in that figure, we really have to understand these divergent paths of institutions. So we have to think about why institutions differ, why they have taken divergent paths, and what these institutional differences do to incentives and economic outcomes. So to do that, let me introduce a few concepts. These are essentially putting labels to the same concepts that I have already described in my discussion of what happened in the North and the South of the Americas. So what the Spaniards were trying to do was to set up extractive economic institutions. These were institutions like the encomienda, repartimiento, mita, that forced people to work on behalf of the elite at low wages and enable the elite to capture all of the spoils of economic activity. Those I'm going to call extractive institutions because they were designed to extract from the many for the benefit of the few. But those extractive institutions didn't exist in a vacuum. They were supported by extractive political institutions. The first thing that the Spaniards did was to actually replace the hierarchy of the Guarani. And the first thing they did in the Incas and the Aztecs is to replace the hierarchies of the Aztecs and the Incas so that they could control political power. What use are economic institutions that tell you to work for low wages if I can't force you to work for low wages? So those political institutions that concentrate power in the hands of a few without any sort of checks and enable them to use repression to get their way, I'm going to call extractive political institutions. At the other extreme are the sorts of institutions that we saw in the context of Jamestown colony. I'm going to call those inclusive institutions. Rather than extract, they're trying to include more people under their umbrella. In particular, how did they work in Jamestown? Well, first they provided secure property rights, the head right system. They gave land and they said you can use the land and if you produce, you can keep it. So secure property rights. They allowed people to trade. Not trade slaves, not trade, in a way that created kind of a totally non-level playing field, but the people who had their own land and produced on that land could actually go to the market. So there was a market economy, but it was a market economy in which a broad cross-section of society could participate on fairly level playing field. They introduced courts, a justice system. People could write contracts. So those are the hallmarks of inclusive economic institutions. But we also saw in the context of the Jamestown that these inclusive economic institutions didn't exist in a vacuum. They had to be supported right away, or they were supported right away, and that, I argued, was for them to be credible by the General Assemblies. And those I'm going to refer to as inclusive political institutions. Sort of polar opposite of the extractive political institutions. They create a more equal distribution of power, sometimes referred to as pluralism, and they don't let anybody have complete control, absolute control of the political power that rests with the state. So at some level, the pluralism that the inclusive political institutions embed is sort of the opposite of the idea of absolutism that had also developed around the same time strongly in many parts of Europe. And the absolutism, no control on the exercise of the power of kings and monarchs. In pluralism, that political power being widely distributed. And of course, the reason why I'm giving these sort of similar names, extractive economic institutions, extractive political institutions, and inclusive economic institutions and inclusive political institutions, is that there are natural synergies between them. So what I try to do here is I try to capture that in a very simple 2x2 matrix, and those arrows are telling you that there is sort of a virtuous circle if you have inclusive institutions and inclusive political institutions. It tends to keep you there. There's no necessity. History is not destiny. But inclusive economic institutions support inclusive political institutions. Inclusive political institutions support inclusive economic institutions. Likewise, for extractive economic institutions and extractive political institutions. Why? Well, let's think about it. Let's take a country with extractive economic institutions, 17th or 18th century Barbados. It's a society in which a very few wealthy planter families owned everything and had the right to hire 90% of, employ 90% of the population as slaves. The slaves did the production, the planters got very rich. Very extractive economic institutions, because they were designed to extract from the many for the benefit of the few. They didn't give any rights, even the right to go to get education, or not even the right to go and sell your labor to whoever you wanted for the vast majority of the population. And ask yourself whether those extractive economic institutions would have been feasible together with inclusive political institutions that actually gave power to that 90% of the population, that distributed power equally in the society. And I think the answer is obviously no. If that 90% had political power, I doubt that they would have used their political power to support a system that was essentially designed to exploit them viciously. So the only way that an extractive economic institution such as slavery can survive is by also allocating political power to the people who are the beneficiaries of that slavery system. So therefore, the off-diagonals of that matrix are generally unstable. If you have extractive economic institutions and inclusive political institutions, there will be either some forces for those institutions to be reformed, for those economic institutions to be reformed in a more inclusive direction, or the inclusive political institutions will be undermined and turned into something much more hierarchical at the benefit of the few who were benefiting from the economic institutions. And the same thing if you are at the other off-diagonal. So what's distinctive about inclusive institutions? The most important thing is that inclusive institutions, just like the head rights system, create incentives for people to invest, increase their productivity, innovate, trade, and generate economic growth. In particular, inclusive institutions are pretty much the only way you can generate sustained economic growth. And by sustained economic growth, I don't mean just a surge of economic growth for a decade or two, but sustained economic growth that goes on for decades or a century or more. And such economic growth, here economics comes to our rescue, has to rely on technological change. It can't just happen by building more and more factories of the same sort. You have to build better and better factories. And technological change, another major figure whose name I'll mention, Joseph Schumpeter, argued more than 70 years ago, that kind of technological change cannot happen but with creative destruction. It's not that it's the same people who were doing the agricultural production and then the textile and then the chemicals and then they're going to do the software, but it's going to be different people who do the agricultural production, different people who do the textile, different people who do the chemicals, and different ones doing the software. And even within a narrow sector, it's going to be the new firms that come with a better technology and replace the old. It's going to be some sectors drawing factors of production from another sector. If you were a landowner, and this is where we again connect with Henry George, and you were making large rents from employing workers, the last thing you want is that creative destruction, because that creative destruction is going to attract the workers away from you to the city or to the industry. So the creative destruction is essential for sustained growth, but already as this description suggests, it is not a very natural phenomenon that will be welcomed by those who are the current elites, because it will often come at the expense of the elite. But in fact, there is more to it. that argument that I've just made says that when creative destruction takes place and when there is economic growth based on technological change and innovation, that will create economic losers. Meaning there will be those who were previously economically benefiting from existing technologies, from the existing system, from the existing system of property rights, and they will lose their rents because they will be driven out of business or their workers will go to other sectors and so on. That is a threat. It's an important threat. But I will maintain that it's a trivial threat relative to the political one. Creative destruction not only reallocates economic rents, but it also reallocates political power. So it's not just that if you allowed free entry for industry into the Caribbean islands, that would have made the slave plantations less profitable. It would have entirely undermined the system that gave political power to those plantation owners. And the fear of creative destruction mostly emanates from the fear of those who are currently holding political power and are afraid of losing that political power because of the winds of change that creative destruction and that technological change brings. So that gives us a picture in which we have some concepts that help us understand when sustained economic growth is possible and more likely, and when it is not. It also already gives us very important clues about why is it that extractive economic and political institutions are not a mistake of history. They're not an aberration. They have their own logic. They are stable, and that was the point I was trying to make with the vicious circle, because they enrich some people, they empower some people. It just happens to be the few who benefit from it. But those few, because they have the political power, are not going to be willing to give it up. And they're not going to be very welcoming to economic growth and technological change because of the fear of creative destruction. So therefore, we have a situation in which these extractive economic and political institutions will naturally emerge. And once they emerge, they will tend to persist. Again, history is not destiny, but it does create certain strong forces towards persistence. But that by itself is not sufficient, because what we see is not just persistence, but also change. And more importantly, no society was born with inclusive institutions. Inclusive institutions developed over time. So we also have to explain why is it that some societies remained with extractive institutions, in fact, deepened their extractive institutions at times, while others broke away from extractive institutions towards inclusive institutions. So therefore, we need to augment the sort of beginning of the theory that I have already provided with a theory of institutional change. So let me try to do that. So at the root of the concepts I have already introduced, you will recognize the role of conflict. Extractive economic and political institutions have their own logic. They tend to persist, but not everybody's happy about them. The 90% who are exploited in the slave societies are not the beneficiaries of the extractive institutions. The few percent who own everything are. So that 90% is not always going to take these things lying down. They will sometimes, from time to time, try to improve their position. That may take the form of negotiations. That may take the form of slave revolts, which were very common in the Caribbean. It may take the form of protests, uprisings, as we've seen during the Arab Spring. It may take some sort of ability, some sort of attempts to improve their economic conditions through other means. But there will be conflict. That conflict will get resolved differently in different societies. When it gets resolved in favor of those who already have power, the extractive economic and political institutions will get strengthened. But when it does get resolved in favor of those revolting or protesting against those extractive institutions, there will be some movements away from these institutions. As this conflict occurs and is resolved in different ways, societies will embark on a path of change. But its path of change will often be small and slow. Think of this as a slow drifting process. And in particular, I will refer to it as institutional drift. The term is very clearly inspired by genetic or evolutionary drift. The idea of genetic or evolutionary drift is take two otherwise identical populations and put them in isolated places. Over time, because of random mutations, they will start drifting apart. They're not communicating with each other. They have their own trajectories. So to the extent that societies have their own political economy trajectories, in the same way that the random mutations push them slightly in different directions, how that conflict is resolved will push these societies in slightly different directions. So England and France and Spain might start all similar, more or less, in the 13th century, but over time, some small differences will open up. Now, if we had to just rely on these small differences to accumulate over time for institutional change, that would be a very, very slow process indeed. And in fact, sometime one thing will happen and then it will get reversed and so on and so forth. But really, the more meaningful change happens not just because of this institutional drift, but because institutional drift interplays with what we're going to call critical junctures. So by critical junctures, we refer to major events that disrupt the balance in society, that create a shock either because of a political occurrence, demographic occurrence, a war, or the opening up of new economic, political, or social opportunities. So what we have then is that we have societies drifting apart and opening up small differences among them. But then when these small differences are hit by critical junctures, that leads to divergence. So critical junctures are the time when the small differences created by institutional drift translate into more major institutional divergence. Before I illustrate what I mean by this in the context of a specific example, let me emphasize that a lot of this is, of course, contingent or stochastic, in the same way that it is very difficult, near impossible, to predict the outcome of evolutionary drift or genetic drift across different populations. It's difficult to say which factors are going to lead one society to move a little bit this way versus a little bit that way. And it's also difficult to say in advance, although again we can say a little bit, when a critical juncture happens, which of these small differences that have emerged are going to be more meaningfully important for the subsequent divergence. Nevertheless, there is quite a bit that we can say. And to do that, let's look at a key turning point towards the emergence of inclusive institutions. And that took place in England in the 17th century during the period that's referred to as the Glorious Revolution, when the English deposed their monarch, James II, and replaced him by a constitutional monarchy led by William of Orange, and together with greater checks on what the monarch could do and transfer of power away from the monarch towards the parliament. Glorious Revolution was a political event, but it opened the way for a radical set of economic changes in economic institutions, which ultimately culminated in the sorts of incentives that underpinned the Industrial Revolution. Though it was no accident that the Industrial Revolution started in England, when in textiles and then in other areas, new innovations were made and were quickly applied to production and led to major increases in output. It was no accident that this took place at the end of the 18th century, essentially about 100 years later than between 50 and 100 years after the major changes in economic and political institutions unleashed by the Glorious Revolution. But the question is, why did the Glorious Revolution happen in England? Why not in Russia? Why not in Austria? Why not in Spain? Why not in France? Well, again, we're asking questions that are somewhat difficult to answer, but the theory sort of helps us at least get some perspective. The notable thing is that actually, even though England looks quite different to us today than Spain and France, there were many similarities. In all of these places, feudalism was already in decline. So the system where people were tied to land and were working as serfs as a form of semi-servile, semi-coercive labor was already in decline. In all three places, in Spain, England, and France, there were parliaments. In England, for example, starting with the Magna Carta, but in France with the États Généraux, and in Spain with the Cortes, also having their roots going back to the medieval ages. In all three places, the state had already achieved some degree of centralization. So, all in all, these places had a lot of parallels. They shared a lot of commonalities. But when a critical juncture arrived, which was the opening of the sea routes to the New World and also through the Atlantic to the Old World, and there was a major surge in international trade and big profit opportunities, not only from gold and silver, not only from slavery, but from all of the trade, England, Spain, and France reacted to this very differently. Why did they react differently? Well, let me focus on Spain, which was one of the early beneficiaries of the Atlantic trade and all of the changes that came with it. Spain benefited from all of its colonies in Latin America, from all of the gold and silver that came from it, but the major beneficiary in the case of Spain was the crown and the parties associated with the crown. And the reason was that all of the colonization expeditions that went were sanctioned by the crown, or essentially were officers of the crown. They were the kings and queens' men who went there, and they brought money back for the monarchy. So, if anything, as a result of all of these things, in Spain the monarchy got very much strengthened, much richer, and in fact the Cortes is nowhere around to be seen. It doesn't get called for 100 years, and the hold of the monarchy increases. If you look at how the English colonization went, it looks very different. It's actually done by privateers and merchants, not by the crown. And as a result of this, the people who actually make money are not the people aligned with the crown, but these new merchants who are actually fighting against the crown and asking for greater privileges, more security for their property rights, and more political voice. So the same critical juncture enriched the people fighting against the crown in one country and the crown in the other country. So why the difference? Well, that's where the initial drift, institutional drift comes in. While there were all these similarities between England and Spain, there were also some small differences. One that turned out to be quite consequential was that in England, the crown's monopoly did not get established over overseas trade. So Elizabeth and then Charles I and James I couldn't, James I and Charles I couldn't monopolize what was going on in the Atlantic. And then after the English Civil War, the same thing was true for Charles II and James II. Whereas the crown's monopoly was quite absolute in Spain, and as a result, the crown could monopolize the entire international trade that was brought in by the Atlantic trade and the entire colonization. So while we have these many, many, many similarities, one small difference at the end turned out to be much bigger than all of those similarities. It determined which were the groups that benefited most from the riches that were being brought by these economic opportunities, and how that critical juncture played out. In one place, the crown got stronger, extractive institutions got stronger. In the other place, the parties fighting against extractive institutions got stronger, and that ultimately led to the Glorious Revolution. The same sort of ideas can also help us explain how feudalism started declining and why that happened in different parts of Europe differently. So when I was talking about how the critical juncture of the Atlantic trade played out, I didn't mention Russia, Austria, Russia, Hungary, or all of the areas in Central Europe. They were already behind by 15th century. They didn't have access to the Atlantic, but even if they had access to the Atlantic, a trajectory like the one in England, the one in England during the 17th century would not have been thinkable, because these places still had servile labor, forced labor doing agricultural production, and very small cities and much less developed merchants and industry. So how did that particular difference occur? Well, again, I think the right perspective is one of thinking of the institutional drift interplaying with critical juncture. This time the critical juncture was the Black Death, with a plague that killed perhaps half of the population in many parts of Europe. And in killing that population, created not only a demographic disaster, but a very unbalanced economic situation. When Black Death hit, feudalism and serfdom were the norm throughout Europe. And when the Black Death hit and people started dying, the first reaction of the lords was to actually try to get the remaining workers to work harder. I had 2 workers to produce food for me. Now one of them is dead. I want the other one to work harder. But counteracting this, the opportunities for the remaining workers were also much better, because the lords were now trying to compete for workers because they had a labor shortage. The cities were trying to compete for labor because they had a labor shortage. So the outside options of labor also improved. So we had these 2 forces going against each other. Extractive institutions wanted to extract more, and the workers see an opportunity perhaps for improving their lot. Again, initial conditions were somewhat different. In Europe, in Western Europe, you already had the cities and somewhat better conditions for workers to start with. So on top of this, the forces that improved the outside option of the workers turned out to be stronger and led to a rapid decline of feudalism. In Eastern Europe, the cities were not there or were much smaller, and the conditions of serfdom were perhaps slightly more onerous, and what happened was actually the intensification of serfdom. This is very important at some level, not only for understanding decline of feudalism, but for emphasizing another point that's a constant throughout this discussion. What I'm talking about here is about economics. What happens to labor scarcity and how this affects wages and production and how production is organized, it's all about economics. But as we can see, we cannot abstract from the politics of it, because the same labor scarcity leads to very different outcomes depending on the politics of it. What was different between Eastern Europe and Western Europe was the politics. And when the politics was in favor of the landlords, and this again would chime well with Henry George's emphasis, the outcome was actually very different. Now, we don't quite have data for Eastern Europe during the Black Death, but we have something else. We have a similar demographic disaster in Latin America. When Europeans came, they not only colonized the Aztec and the Inca empires, but they also brought their diseases. The demographic disaster that this created was arguably even larger than the Black Death, perhaps killing up to 80, perhaps 90% of the population of many parts of the thing that had already become the Spanish Empire. So again, a sort of an economic theory, pure economic theory, would suggest that just exactly like it happened in Western Europe, in England and France, during Black Death, the decline in population should create labor scarcity and upward pressure on wages. So here are what the data that we have from the Spanish records. We see the population decline, and we look at the wages. No increase in wages. If anything, the wages are actually declining. What's going on? Why are the laws of economics being violated? Well, because the politics is very different. The laws of economics, the labor scarcity is for competitive markets. These workers are not competitive. They're draft workers. They're forced workers. So what happens actually is that, if you look at the record, what the Spanish colonialists start to do is that they start being much more coercive, because now there's greater pressure on wages, but they can keep that pressure down by using coercion. So we don't know that this is exactly what happened in Eastern Europe, but this sort of suggests that that's probably a good model for what went on in Eastern Europe during the Black Death and in the subsequent 2 centuries when the serfdom got intensified. So now let's revisit the early Latin American experience. Why is it that when we look at that chart and we see Western Europe take off in the 19th and 20th century, and we see the Western European offshoots like the United States, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia take off during the 1800s and 1900s, we don't see Latin America take off? Why is it that, what is it that's making Europe, these other places take off and not Latin America? And I think, again, that goes to the heart of the question. I've already mentioned the Industrial Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution is, of course, key. The 19th and the 20th centuries were the time of industrialization. They were the age of industry. The countries that were growing rapidly were the ones that were industrializing, and the industrial technology was spreading like wildfire in North America, which with the United States playing a major role in pushing the technological frontier and being at first as innovative and later more innovative than where the Industrial Revolution started in the first place, the United Kingdom. But Industrial Revolution, which was embraced in the North, was not welcome in Latin America. Latin America by this time had already cemented its extractive economic and political institutions. The elites that were controlling things at first didn't want industrialization. So the first 80 years or so of the of the 19th century, there was no industrial activity in much of Latin America. Later on, there was some attempt to industrialization, but it happened very differently than in the United States. In the United States, industrialization was truly a democratic process. If you look at the people who got the patents, who started the factories, they weren't the elite. They weren't even the sons and daughters of the rich people. They were just regular folks, like people like Thomas Edison, who didn't come from any particularly advantageous background. But when Mexico, and later places like Guatemala, Argentina, and so on, finally jumped on the bandwagon of being integrated with the world economy and trying to invest in the industry, it was a very different sort of affair. It was highly monopolized. It was happening under dictatorial regimes, and it was the friends of the dictator who got the licenses to produce industrial goods, and so that they could actually make a lot of money out of that. And the sort of processes that led to the creative destruction were certainly kept under check. What about in Europe? We see Europe fairly light color in that first figure, but that light color masks fairly large differences in Europe. While Western Europe not only was the first one to throw away feudalism and servile labor, it was also the one to industrialize. What happened in the East was very different. Industrialization happened first in England, which had already thrown away the extractive institutions with the Glorious Revolution, and then quickly, or not quickly, but gradually democratized in the 19th century. And in France, with the French Revolution and its subsequent changes, the absolutist regimes survived and in fact became very strong in much of Central and Eastern Europe. For example, Austria-Hungarian Empire, which was one of the strong dominant powers, had a very, very different attitude towards industrialization than England or France. So Francis I and his right-hand man Metternich, for example, steadfastly refused all sorts of industry. They steadfastly refused railways because they thought these things would actually destabilize their power. So this was really fear of creative destruction in action. So, for instance, Metternich said, we don't desire at all that great masses shall become well-off and independent. How can we otherwise rule over them? So that was the attitude, because the main thing they were afraid of wasn't becoming poor or becoming backward, but the main thing they were afraid of was losing their control over the country. And they saw industrialization and all of the things associated with industrialization, like railways, as harbingers of this instability. So Nicholas I in Russia had the same attitudes. Railways were viewed as potential bringers of revolution and unrest, and there was no natural reason for them. The same sort of thing happened in other empires that kept their absolutist bent. The Ottoman Empire also witnessed its absolutism survive and became stronger. And there, not only industrialization, but all sorts of change was very strongly resisted. So for example, when the printing press was discovered or was invented in the 15th century, it quickly spread in Europe because in most parts of Europe, there weren't strong enough authorities that could stop the spread of the printing press, at least to the cities. In Europe, the printing press and any sort of human capital that would be for the masses was viewed with great suspicion, and the sultans and the elites passed legislation after legislation banning all sorts of use of the printing press well into the 19th century. The only experience with the first printing press in 1727 was only allowed to print a handful of religious texts and then was shut down. So this all may appear like a relic from a forgotten age, except that it's not. If we want to understand if we want to understand poverty today, we really have to again think about extractive institutions. And of course, we live in a civilized world today, you would say. You know, we have the internet, we have all these wireless technologies, we have kind of lived and went through all of these different phases of history. But extractive institutions are still present. And in fact, in many parts of the world, when you look at it, they have a very similar logic. And when they can be, they are as vicious as before. So today, in Uzbekistan, the most important produce, cotton, still relies on forced labor. But perhaps more ironically, it's not the forced labor of men and women, it's forced labor of children. The dictatorship of Karimov has destroyed all sorts of incentives in agriculture, so people let their agricultural capital depreciate and atrophy. So at the end, they faced a crisis that the cotton harvest fell. So they came up with a great solution. Increase the labor supply, and you do that by using school children. So now, at the cotton picking season, all school children are shipped to cotton fields to work for free as cotton pickers. So, you know, that doesn't look so different from the forced labor systems that we saw in the 16th century and the 17th century. If we want to understand why Africa is poor, we again have to think about extractive institutions. Of course, these extractive institutions have historical origins. We have to think about European colonization of Africa. We have to think about the slave trade and so on. But all of these are relevant today because they have been a mechanism to cement extractive institutions today. There are few places in sub-Saharan Africa today where property rights are secure, the elites allow a level playing field, the courts work in an unbiased fashion, and it's no surprise that productivity is low and people are discouraged from investing. And since I want to leave time for questions, let me skip the discussion of the slave trade, but let me sort of mention two other examples because they sort of show how extractive institutions with a very similar logic still continue today. And one of them, is not with us right now, but it was with us until 1994, is the apartheid regime in South Africa. So if you think about the logic of the apartheid regime, it was no different than the plantation economies in Barbados or Jamaica or Cuba and Haiti. It was a society where a small fraction owned the property, and the remainder had to do the production. The remainder didn't have any political power. The African majority did not have the rights to participate in politics, and they were heavily repressed. But if you actually think of the structure of the apartheid economy and society, it really makes it clear that the whole design of it was to cement these extractive institutions. So for example, Verwoerd, who was the architect of the apartheid, sort of summarized the logic of it. The Bantu must be guided to serve his own community in all respects. There is no place for him in the European community above the level of a certain forms of labor, which actually in practice meant that they were barred from almost all skilled occupations, so they could just work as unskilled laborer in agriculture or in mining. For that reason, it is no avail to him to receive a training, they didn't receive any education, which has its aim absorption into the European community. So the whole design of this was that they were actually kept away from the European community. So that was the dual society in which the location of people was also regulated. And what that actually meant is that not only they were coerced, but they also had so little economic opportunity outside the mining and the agricultural labor that they were forced to supply their labor for very cheap. So a sort of logic that's very similar to what applied during slavery in the South, the US South, or in Jamaica and Barbados. And in all of this, actually, the fact that these extractive institutions are building on the origins of other extractive institutions through a sort of a process like the vicious circle that I described earlier on is worth noting. These extractive institutions oftentimes are not created out of thin air. They are a continuation of processes that have started much earlier. And when I talk of persistence here, it's actually important to emphasize that I don't mean an unchanging form in which the same institution is visible day in and day out. Actually, the form of the institutions, the way that they do the extraction changes. We've already seen that, for example, in the context of Mexico. First, we had coerced labor, and then we had industrialization, but the industrialization was very unequal. During industrialization, it was the elite that was making the money, and that was the same thing in Guatemala, that was the same thing in El Salvador. You see the same sort of persistence in other places. So for instance, in Sierra Leone, you see an independence government that throws out the colonial power, but then it recreates more or less the same tools that the colonial power was using in order to extract from its own people. So the government by the, of Shaka Stevens, for example, in Sierra Leone, used exactly the same sort of marketing board that the British had used for extracting resources from agriculture. They used the same sort of monopolization of the diamond mines in order to extract resources. They even did the same thing in the way of trying to politically isolate certain parts of the population by getting rid of certain railway lines and so that the parts of the country that were opposed to Shaka Stevens' rule could not actually develop and economically and become a real threat. So I can add to these examples because I think in many cases where you see these most extreme forms of economic failure, you do also see the sorts of extractive institutions that I've been talking about. But I want to end in the last few minutes by arguing a point that I have already mentioned a few times, that when I talk of vicious circle, and when my when the theory that Jim and I have been trying to develop emphasizes vicious circles, this is not a form of persistence in which history is destiny, or there is some sort of predetermination in the same way that a theory based on geographic characteristics or cultural characteristics would emphasize. And to do that, let me mention two examples and where a pattern of extractive institutions was broken and was replaced by more inclusive economic institutions. The first is how the Southern equilibrium in the United States came to an end, where by the Southern equilibrium, what I mean is the low-wage structure based on agriculture and low education black labor force that survived even after the Civil War through the redemption period well into the 20th century. And the way that that came to an end actually has a lot in common with the way in which the Glorious Revolution took place in England, in the way that General Assemblies were fought for and won in the United States, in the way that in which the French Revolution took place, is that there was actually pressure from the people who were the majority and did not have any rights. So when you think of many of these cases of breaking the mold, the commonality is that the conflict that exists as an integral part of these extractive institutions finally gets resolved in favor of the people who are the majority. And that happens oftentimes because they are able to solve their collective action problem and pose a more concerted resistance to the forces of the extractive institutions. So for example, in the US South, that happened through the civil rights movement that mounted a major challenge to the equilibrium that existed in the US South. In the Arab Spring today, it's happening exactly through the same sort of protests and uprisings that we have seen in Tahrir Square or in Tunisia. I also want to emphasize, but without going into the detail, that there is also no historical determinism that says that sub-Saharan Africa, because it had a colonial history, was is somehow totally unable to escape from extractive institutions. And the best example for that is Botswana. So Botswana, that started independence as one of the poorest countries in the world with literally no educated people and almost no roads, developed a democratic system and became one of the fastest growing countries, probably the fastest growing country of the last 50 years. And again, that sort of took place because there was a major political change, and that political change brought a significant move away from extractive towards inclusive institutions. So let me then try to wrap up and take some questions. But what I want to sort of emphasize in wrapping up is that the set of issues that we've been trying to grapple with, I think, are central ones for social science, and they're central ones for us as humanity to understand the conditions in which we live in and why the conditions in which we live in are so unequal around the globe. These are weighty questions, but I think social science holds the promise of making progress and improving our understanding and perhaps ultimately our policy and choices on these topics. And what I've been trying to emphasize is that there is a coherent theory that has a lot of explanatory power that emphasizes institutions, the development of institutions, and the incentives that they create. And I think that's a very promising alternative relative to the somewhat more common theories that emphasize culture, geography, or the mistakes, or the smartness, or the brains, or the ideology of leaders. And I think, of course, time will show how effective these different theories will be in helping us develop a deeper understanding. So I'll take some questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Acemoglu. So we have time for questions, so don't hesitate to ask.
I don't necessarily want to take you someplace you're not comfortable going. But it does seem to me, having read your remarks, that it says on. It does seem to me, having heard your remarks, that it's equally possible for an inclusive institution to drift by way of public policy choices through a critical juncture that renders it an exclusive or an extractive institution. What are your thoughts on that phenomenon?
Absolutely, and you're 100% right, and that's something we do address quite a bit at length in the book, and I just didn't have time to talk about it. And it's exactly sort of the mirror image in some sense, that the same sort of conflict that exists that sometimes chips at extractive institutions also exists when you have inclusive institutions. So one of the examples we give in the book, for example, is the Venetian Republic. So the Venetian Republic became very prosperous on a fairly democratic and inclusive set of political institutions and very developed economic institutions. But because these economic institutions were very much based on trade, and monopolizing trade was much more profitable than competing in trade, after a while, some groups were able to increase their political power. They started using their political power to block out others from trade, and that increased their economic profits, increased conflict in society. They started being more dominant, led to some instability in which they sort of almost like a civil war, and ultimately leading to the sort of unraveling of these Venetian institutions, and Venice stopped growing, in fact probably regressed after these periods. Some people argue Rome went through a similar process, although I think there is, one should not over-exaggerate, overemphasize the extent to which Rome had inclusive institutions, because at every stage it was based on slavery and quite a lot of coercion, although there was a lot of trade and some parts of it had fairly well-developed laws. So, of course, one question that people then ask is, what about the United States? Are we at the cusp of having our inclusive institutions being eroded? And I think the answer is, I don't know. But one thing is that, I think the United States does face some unique set of challenges today, but it did face some unique set of challenges in the past too, and it was able to pull through. One episode that I have in mind here is at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, where the concentration of wealth and political power in the hands of a few had reached pretty high proportions with the robber barons and their political dominance. But again, a sort of a political revolution of sorts, people becoming mobilized through media, the populist movement and the progressive movements and so on, they were able to push back and actually start a process of major reforms that are still the basis of our antitrust laws and limits on monopoly and so on and so forth. So I'm not willing to give up hope, but we do live in pretty interesting times, let's put it that way.
I was wondering your views on globalization and if it's undermining our democratic processes and able to regulate us, or if we're populist into the World Trade Organization, things like that, and increasing inequality and not sharing the wealth between the top 1% and the bottom 99%, and the increasing influence of the top 1% on our politics in cases like the Citizens United versus the FEC that says corporations are people, they can spend unlimited amounts in our politics.
Okay, well, excellent question, but you really are asking, in my opinion, two different questions. The second question you're asking is about, I think has a lot of parallels with the first question, which is about the sort of inclusive comparatively inclusive institutions, political institutions that we have in the United States being eroded by a very unequal distribution of wealth, much more unequal distribution of wealth in the United States today than any time in the last 70 years, probably as unequal as at the beginning of the 20th century, and also an associated increase in the lobbying activity that is made possible. And I think my answer to that is exactly the same, that I think those are alarming trends, but I think there are also, I do also have some hope in some trust in the flexibility and resilience of the US institutions. And I think the fact that a lot more people are talking about these issues and about this 99% versus 1% is the same sort of issues that mobilize people during the era of the robber barons. I have no ability to say how it will resolve, but I think there are lots of reasons to be alarmed, but there are also some source for being at least cautiously optimistic that this is not the end. The first part of your story is about globalization, which does perhaps intersect with it, that globalization may have had some role to do, something to do with the increase in inequality between the top and the bottom of the US income distribution. But I think globalization is much more of a complex phenomenon. And I think my take on it would be the following: that I don't think that it's possible to make a blanket statement that globalization is good or bad once you take the politics into account. It really depends on how globalization is happening and within what context. And let me try to illustrate that. Let me first try to give an example of a globalization that really was extremely transformative in the positive direction. That's the Atlantic trade that actually led to the changes in the balance of power in Europe, and as I argued, was the central factor leading to the Glorious Revolution. I think in the same way, there are several other examples in which globalization, by creating economic opportunities and creating more dynamism for certain parts of the society, does act like a force towards change. On the other hand, there are also several examples in which globalization has been a force towards cementing or strengthening the extractive institutions. I've also given some examples of that. And one of them is, again, the Atlantic trade with Spain. In Spain, because globalization happened in the context of a political situation in which the crown controlled everything, it actually made the crown richer and politically more powerful. Other examples of globalization again fit that pattern. So when finally Guatemala and Argentina became part of the world economy, that was a huge globalization move. But at the end, what it did is that it enriched the very few people who were the landowners and exporters of natural resources, and didn't do anything else for the rest of the economy. Another example of globalization that probably was quite destructive for the political equilibrium is, again, from one of the examples I used, are the plantation colonies. What made the plantation colonies possible? It was the export of sugar. If they weren't exporting sugar in an fairly open economy, they wouldn't have been able to have a plantation system, because what would you do with all of that sugar produced through slavery and so on if you weren't able to trade them? So in other words, I think globalization, I think that this debate about globalization is good, globalization is bad, I don't find that particularly instructive, because I think it needs to be in the context of in what institutional setting that globalization is happening, and which sorts of economic gains it's producing, and what sorts of pressures it's putting on the political system. And I think when we look at it that way, there are also more constructive steps that we can take. For example, I think it is generally good for the United States to be part of a global economy, but when that happens in the context of the labor market institutions that protected the low paying people being dismantled and a very kind of a distorted system that does create a lot of hardship at the bottom and lots of people losing their jobs. So I think that's the sort of discussion that I find more relevant in this context. So whether the WTO is giving the right advice, no, I don't think it is, because the WTO's advice is very much devoid of the institutional setting. It is exactly this sort of thing. Globalization is good, globalization is bad. And I don't think that's very useful.
Greece.
Greece. How many hours do we have?
I guess my question is, what are type of changes, institutional changes, Greece can follow in order not to fail. I'm not saying they're failing. I mean, the economic system is failing. Political system is not functioning. So any institutional changes may take place. They happen at the EU level, imposed in Greece. So what should we expect?
Well, tough question. I really don't know the answer.
Thank you.
Let me just say 2 sentences just to underlie that I don't know the answer. I've been working on this topic for almost 12 years. So this is 13 years. 13 years. This is and I've been giving talks like this, of this form, more academic, less academic, broad audience, and so on and so forth. And until about 2 years ago, when people asked me examples of successful institutional changes, one of them that I would mention is the European Union. How the being part of the European Union and the prospect of being part of the European Union led to fairly important improvements in the institutions in many countries. Now I know that's not true, for Greece at least. So I think the problem is, it's a very difficult problem, because, I think the way that Greece got integrated into the European Union just strengthened the more dysfunctional part of the Greek political system. And now the question is, how can that be fixed without Greece going out of the European Union, which is a tough problem. And probably Greece does not want to go out of the European Union, and it's not likely or feasible. So we have a tough economic problem and tough political problem. I don't have the solution.
I have a question. Okay. I'm a visiting scholar from Beijing. Yeah, but I just want to ask a question. My question is that for China, for more than 30 years, China has enjoyed constant and steady economic growth. I just want to could you give the explanation institutionally the reason why that thing can happen now? Okay, please.
Yeah, so I think that's another major question. It's a major question on which we spend a chapter and a half in the book. I didn't have time to talk about it in the talk, so thank you for raising it. And I will give a two-layered answer. The first layer is that there's one part of the Chinese experience that's very much consistent with what I've talked about, which is that China languished under Mao's communist economic policies. And then the major changes came when Deng Xiaoping started liberalizing the economic system. So it's one level how you have a very, very radical change in economic institutions going from essentially no property rights, no incentives, to first incentives in agriculture and then in industry, and then that leading to economic growth is very much consistent with the emphasis here. On the other hand, there's a second part which is very much at odds with, or at least appears with very much at odds with what I have emphasized here, which is that China has taken major steps towards inclusive economic institutions, but it is under a very extractive political institutions in which political power is concentrated in the hands of a narrow elite in the form of the Communist Party. So how is it that China is having 30 years of very, very rapid economic growth for so long? And I think the answer there is related to what I talked about at the beginning in some sort of a implicit way, that I emphasized extractive institutions are not inconsistent with growth surges, but they're inconsistent with sustained growth. So I would claim that China is still in the midst of a catch-up growth, which doesn't really come with major creative destruction. And in fact, China is not the only example of this. There was another country that went through 30 years of very, very rapid economic growth, the most rapid at the time, and many people on the basis of this became totally enamored with the system of that country and started writing books. In fact, most of our principles economics textbook have sections on that, about how there was an alternative that was perhaps superior, and that was Soviet Russia. So Soviet Russia started a very rapid process of industrialization, reached breakneck rates of economic growth throughout the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and then totally petered out. And that happened in Soviet Russia for almost 40 years under no market incentives whatsoever. So in some sense, China is clearly doing things much better than the Soviet Union because it has fairly good market incentives in the economic sphere, even if the party still interferes a lot with the allocation of resources, both in finance and industry. But I think that the Russian experience is a warning sign. And I think China is still in the midst of catch-up growth. After 30 years of very, very rapid economic growth, it's still around 15% of the GDP per capita of the United States. So there's still some more room for catch-up economic growth. But after a while, this catch-up economic growth is going to get run out of steam. And then the question is China going to follow the Soviet Russia trajectory or the South Korea trajectory? South Korea started with extractive political institutions, liberalized its markets, gave incentives, and after a while, there was a strong democracy movement that they tried to put down for a while, but then the democracy movement was strong enough, and the extractive political institutions collapsed. Or the Soviet path, where the extractive institutions are going, the political institutions are going to be strong enough, and essentially sap all of the economic energy out of it before they collapse. So I think that's another question mark.
Okay, I think this is very suggestive.
Why are you focusing simply on the income per person in the nation as the measure for the wealth of the nation? Obviously, there are other considerations, both philosophical and economic.
Sure, because we have to start somewhere. And if you look at it, income per capita is fairly highly correlated with lots of other things that I personally think it's good, and economists in general think it's good. It's correlated with low poverty, it's correlated with high life expectancy, it's correlated with better living conditions, it's correlated with access to lots of basic necessities. So to a first approximation, I think if we can lift the income per capita of the poorest billion people in the world today, that would be the most positive thing that can be done in the world. This is not to deny all of these philosophical issues, but I think poverty trumps philosophy.
One more question, please.
Okay. Yep.
As a non-economist, I found your theory useful in explaining a lot of phenomena and looking forward to thinking about other historical examples. As I tried to apply it to the recent economic crises, it occurred to me that trust perhaps is a critical factor within the distinction between extractive and inclusive institutions. And perhaps transparency is a related example to that. Could you comment on that in relation to the economic?
Yeah, I think trust is important. I think more generally social norms are important. But I would like to think about these social norms, and again, we try to do this a little bit in the book, but not sufficient. At the end, we had to draw the line at 500 and some pages and not become 2,000 pages. So trust and social norms are important. Without the social norms maintaining these institutions, they can't function. It's very central that people believe that the courts are going to be unbiased in the United States. Otherwise, they wouldn't be meaningful. If people stopped trusting the media, then the media couldn't inform the people, although in the United States we have some risk of that happening. And trust is very central, but all of these things, I don't think they are religious or national characteristics. They are also shaped by the same historical institutional processes. So for example, when you look at the World Values Survey and look at Sub-Saharan Africa, you see much lower levels of trust in Sub-Saharan Africa than in any other part of the world. And when you actually look at the origins of it, it seems that it's very strongly related to the slavery experience. So Sub-Saharan Africa went through a slavery period where for about 300 years, people were raiding their own families and their neighbors' children and selling them into slavery. So I think it's likely that a process like that erodes the trust relationships in society. So at some level, trust is important, but trust itself has sort of the same sort of political and social roots that we've been trying to sort of develop and emphasize.
Okay, I would like to thank everyone for attending this lecture.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Okay, this concludes the 26th annual Henry George Pierce. Good night.